COVID-19 pandemic wreaks havoc in South Africa and across the globe. Millions are dying and getting infected. Vaccinating a significant proportion of the population is the only realistic way to defeat the pandemic globally and locally. This will require international cooperation and social solidarity. Not vaccine apartheid, not vaccine nationalism, and certainly not corporate profiteering. Unprecedented unity in action of all sectors of our society are of great vigilance and social solidarity if we are to slow the rate of infection and ensure that our health facilities do not become overwhelmed. Workers' World is back, and Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So which one of them you think is best? When I did
Welcome to our first show of the 2021 season. Few gremlins in the studio here. I'm your host, Helge Jansen Daubert. The COVID-19 pandemic has severely affected the world's people. Millions have been infected by the virus, and billions of people's livelihoods and lives have been negatively impacted upon. But now there is hope. Several vaccines have been rapidly developed to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. But how do these vaccines work? Are they safe? And will we have enough to roll out in time to prevent further social disaster? In today's show, we look at what is a vaccine and how does it help us to achieve immunity from diseases. Stay with us. In studio to discuss this, we're welcoming Thembeka Mjala, clearly no stranger to the Workers' World team, and as Program Officer with the Alternate Information and Development Center. Welcome, Thembeka.
Thank you.
And joining us via Zoom, we have Dr. Leslie London, who is with the People's Health Movement. He's Deputy Secretary, he's with the People's Health Movement. We're also joined by Dr. James van Dieren, Deputy Secretary of the People's Health Movement. Thank you to both of us for joining us on Zoom, and it's great to have you and Thembeka in our studio.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
Before we go into our discussion, let's take a look at an insert that has been produced by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team.
COVID-19 affects old people much more than young people. It affects people who have comorbidities. It affects people who have hypertension and diabetes. It affects people who are obese. And so if we don't find a vaccine, our most vulnerable people in South Africa will have adverse events from COVID-19 and may even die. And so it's our job to find a COVID vaccine for South Africa so that we can control the epidemic here.
The beauty of a vaccine is it teaches our immune system how to make COVID-19 antibodies before we get the infection. And the way that they do that is they contain something that looks like the spike protein, but is not a virus. Your body thinks it's being infected by something, and the immune system produces antibodies against that spike protein. So your body then has antibodies within it, and when you get infected by COVID-19, those antibodies can block the spike protein before the virus can enter your cells. That's the principle about how all vaccines work. There are currently 7 COVID-19 vaccines that all work in slightly different ways, but using the same principles.
What a vaccine does is it primes the immune system ahead of time. So you let it see if you like, almost a pretend version of the pathogen, a sample of the pathogen, so that the immune system can get its machinery going and get primed, so that if it sees the pathogen through infection, that immune system is ready to roll immediately.
Ik werk op het Texas, ik rijd taxi hier, Johannes Mainsis. Ja, en dat is allemaal wat ik wil kan zeggen. Maar oké, zoals ik jullie kan zeggen van die wet zien van die COVID-besigheid. De COVID is een speelding. Ik heb COVID gehad, maar ik heb oorgekomen. Nou, ik zal lijken zo mee een nieuwe vaccine te krijgen, want alle allemaal praat van hem, maar ik heb nog niet gekregen. En zoals hier op het Texas, zoals jullie weten, onze weken is een beetje in danger, want allemaal die mensen klimmen die taxi zo naar Maasten en goed, alle sanitizer willen niet. Maar nou ook wat weken op het Texas, onze leven is een groot gevaar met die COVID-besigheid.
If they give people the vaccine, it will help so much because people are getting sick because of COVID. So I think the vaccine is very good.
Ndicinga be safe kuba ke ndithemba le company kuthi uyayenza.
For uba ndingeka like andikavazi zinto ngayo like i-side effects ezimbi. So I think it's right.
The illness that you would get with not taking it, I think would be far more severe. Even if there were some complications that some people had with the vaccine.
Ultimately, we're going to need a vaccine or herd immunity to get ourselves out of the pickle. And that's the point where we are at the moment, where we're saying, okay, we do have a vaccine now. We need to get it rolled out so we can get herd immunity and then hopefully find our way out of the pandemic.
Herd immunity or population immunity is sometimes a better term to use, is when enough people in the population, for example, South Africa, are immune or resistant to COVID-19. So you can become resistant or immune to COVID-19 by being infected before, so that you have produced antibodies, or you can become immune or resistant to COVID-19 through being vaccinated.
We will receive vaccine doses for around 10% of our population through the COVAX facility. It is estimated that Africa as a whole will need 1.5 billion doses to immunize the target of 60% of the population of our continent.
Ndizayithatha vaccine ayikhona because izandikhusela. I believe bayizandikhusela.
I'm not afraid of taking the vaccine, but it must be a correct one and it must be tested thoroughly.
I would rather take that a chance, and because it was like 1 in a million that got a bit ill from taking the vaccine. So I would take the vaccine definitely.
Yazi bafuna ndithini uzindivaccinate, but ndiyayirhalela because ndiqhuba iteksi, ndibana nabantu abaninzi every day. Okwesibini lasha namane asele endarheni, ngoku ndenza ndizifile ndi-unsafe engafakanga vaccine.
I'll be taking it because I was also sick because of COVID. So I think I'll take it to prevent so that it will not affect me again.
Welcome back. You're watching the Workers' World Labour Show, and we're coming to you in a time of extreme fear. Today, Tuesday, Thursday, the 11th of June, the Premier of the province of the Western Cape has announced that the province is officially in the third wave. The Director General of the National Department of Health has confirmed that we're also in a third wave with more than 9,000 cases reported in the last 24 hours. This is indeed unprecedented times, made more so by the social solidarity which each and every one of us have to express, particularly as the Department of Health rolls out the vaccine program. As we saw on the insert, the elderly are the first in the first wave to get vaccinated in the general population, but they require our assistance to get registered. If there are elderly people in your societies, in your communities, in your families, it is up to each and every one of us to make sure that they get registered, to accompany them in the safest possible way to get to a vaccine center. We go to a break. We'll be back after this.
top stories this week. CTICC to be turned into mass vaccination site, one of first vaccination centers of hope. SAFTA dismayed by worsening unemployment. And moving abroad, a mass picket took place at New York port against Zim Tarragona cargo ship. Stay tuned for the full bulletin.
Welcome back. Thanks, Michaela. Professor London, let's begin with you. It's been 1 year and 2 months since the pandemic became part of our lives. The first moments were terrifying, and now it is indeed something we have to live with. Just recap for us the development of the pandemic and its impact over these last 14 months.
So you're right, it's quite a pandemic. It's something that we never thought we'd ever live through. The first cases came from Wuhan in China in December in 2019, in fact. And in January 2020, the World Health Organization declared it an emergency. And within 2 months, it was a pandemic. And that was in March last year. And then by the end of April, we were in lockdown. So by declaring it a pandemic, the World Health Organization basically gave countries the signal that they could take measures to protect their population, or should take measures. And in fact, South Africa took quite strong measures, very strong measures. We had one of the most strongest and severe lockdowns. And that actually helped us weather the first wave to some extent, but not exactly. So we had a slower first wave. To date, you know, we've had quite a severe epidemic in South Africa, 1.7 million cases, and those are the ones we know about, 57,000 deaths. In Africa, we are probably the most severely hit. And it's been obviously a situation where we've had to respond by limiting people's ability to work or raise income. So that's had an adverse effect. So on the one hand, we have the disease threatening our health. On the other hand, we have the measures we need to take to limit the spread, threatening our livelihoods. And we've seen the terrible consequences of that people have been pushed into poverty. Health inequality has gone up 6 times since the COVID epidemic, and people are much more dependent on grants for survival. And we have to find a way to get out of this. And the vaccines offer us an opportunity if we work together, if we express solidarity, because we need to vaccinate people relatively quickly and at the same time across the world. Because if we don't, then the disease will continue to remain with us and create these so-called variants. We'll get to it later, but the point is that the people in the north, the wealthy countries in the north, are thinking very short-sightedly about how to control this problem.
Before we get to Tembeka in studio, let's bring James van Duren into this, Deputy Secretary of the People's Health Movement. Doc James, tell us, Prof. Leslie, of course, has sketched us the last 14 months, but we are not unfamiliar with the vaccine regime. Every new parent knows that, you know, your baby needs to take a series of vaccines in the first 12 months. Just give us very quickly, what are vaccines and why are they necessary, and why specifically for COVID-19 and not just the normal flu vaccine?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having us. Yes, you're right. So most parents, particularly moms and their kids who take their kids to a lot of the local clinics for their routine vaccinations, will know that children are routinely given a number of immunizations as part of what the government calls the extended program on immunization. So vaccines are one of the real core baseline weapons we have in our arsenal against infectious diseases, particularly in childhood, but also into later life. Vaccines alone save 2 to 3 million lives a year, it's estimated globally, and that's only going to increase as we develop more vaccines for different types of diseases. So vaccines, to your question about why we can't just have a flu vaccine, vaccines are basically specifically designed for individual infections. And what they are is a tool, as I heard on the little video clip that you played, a tool that is able to mimic the effect of being infected with a virus so that your body's immune system can recognize the virus when it is exposed to it in reality. So they are generally either subcomponents of little proteins of a infectious agent, or they are inactivated viruses themselves that are used to give your body a early warning system, basically, to show your body what it will be like when it is exposed to the real infection, so that it's got its guns loaded, so to speak. And so they are one of the tools in our arsenal. They're one of the easiest tools to use because it can be able to prevent a whole series of diseases with just one injection, or two injections in the case of some of the COVID vaccines that we might talk about.
Thank you for that, James. I want to bring Tembeka into the conversation, and we're going to move a little bit away from the science right now, and perhaps just come to the ideologies behind the rollout. I know, and Leslie and James will give us more insight into the People's Health Movement, but Tembeka, this notion of vaccine apartheid, and we saw on the insert that many people who spoke were eager to take it, that there is a greater measure of trust in the science, but yet the rollout thereof is a little bit uneven. We have countries in the north that are busy opening up. We have pockets here in our own country that where the vaccine rollout is going quite smoothly, but there are also pockets where the vaccine is not reaching people. How is that causing vaccine apartheid?
Problem with, with us in the developing country or developing world is that we are dependent on developed countries for a global pandemic that is affecting everyone. So the message is that it should be fair, equitable, and accessible to everyone, because this is a global pandemic that is affecting everyone. Now, the greed from the big pharmaceutical or vaccine producers, which are mainly based in the developed countries, is what has overshadowed the production of vaccines. And the fact that they do not want to share information, technology, and the know-how with the developing countries of how to manufacture a vaccine and how to build your own capabilities as a developing country is a problem. And that's what has hindered the provision of vaccines.
And Tembeka, just to, as an aside, ironically, it was South Africa, the Ramaphosa administration, who was the first to talk about WTO rules to be relaxed so that the IP, the intellectual property for the manufacture of the vaccine, could be released for everybody, so that countries in Africa, countries in Latin America, in the global south, could produce their own vaccines. Do you have maybe some insight as to how far that debate is at the trade level? Whether it's gaining traction.
Yeah, that's very political. And you must remember the WTO, World Trade Organization, when they put these rules and regulations, they were only putting them for the benefit of their own corporations. So you cannot expect them to freely, give us or say remove these patent laws in order for you to save your own people, because theirs is based on market related, which is profit based and greed and profit maximization. So that's what is hindering. The message is good for South Africa and other countries in the developing world to say, WTO, your rules are now unfair because this is a global pandemic, and in emergency situations like ours in South Africa, where most people have died, you should be wavering And I would go further to say not a temporary waiver if I was, but waive it permanently, because this thing is really unfair on everything, because we dependent on you. You dictate terms for us, for our own well-being and our own health, and that's really unfair.
And the irony, Leslie, thank you for that, Tembeka, and the irony for that, of this, is that it's 40 years since the HIV/AIDS pandemic struck the world, and we are back to intellectual property around medicines that can save lives. Prof. London, give us a sense of where the People's Health Movement is in the very issues that Tembeka raises.
So, People's Health Movement is a global social movement with different chapters, and it's organized around two principles. One is that health is a right, that everybody has the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And secondly, that health is a product of social determinants. In other words, it's not something you get from a tablet or a doctor. It's something that's determined by many factors, and many of those things are housing, water, sanitation, etc., and really politics. And I think the way in which COVID has happened has shown quite clearly that politics determines who lives and who dies. What happened with HIV was very interesting, because we had a massive global movement that put pressure on the WTO, and the WTO made concessions, and these concessions are called flexibilities, which means that if you have HIV, you can invoke something called parallel importation.
Prof. London, I'm going to have to ask you, Prof. London, I'm going to have to ask you to press pause. We have to go to an ad break, but we're going to come back to this. Okay. Don't go away. We'll be back after this.
Sure.
You're watching Workers' World Labour News. I am Michaela Miller. Thanks for joining us. The Western Cape government and the city of Cape Town have reached joint agreement to turn the Cape Town International Convention Centre into a mass vaccination site. It is envisaged that the site will be used for high volumes of vaccinations as part of both the province and city's commitment to vaccinating as many of our residents as possible against COVID-19. The official unemployment increased by 0.1% to 32.6% in the first quarter of 2021 from 32.5% in the last quarter of 2020. The expanded unemployment rate, which includes those who have given up looking for jobs, increased by 0.6% from 42.6% in December 2020 to 43.2% in March 2021. According to SAFTA's media test, Stats SA gives misleading data about the economy because they consider minerals taken from the ground as purely income, forgetting that they should also subtract from our natural wealth since the minerals are non-renewable. On a Sunday, the newly formed hashtag Block the Boat Coalition made history by holding the first ever protest line for Palestine in the port of New York, despite the difficulty of commuting the terminal and the heat. 500 people mobilized to let the dock workers in the International Longshoremen Association at the Mahir terminal know that Israeli Zim container ships are profiting off apartheid, and that Palestine's labor unions have called for dock workers around the world to refuse to unload Israeli ships. The police attempted to keep them within a designated barricaded area away from the front gate where they could interact with the workers entering the facility. This successful picket for Palestine against the Israeli Zim shipping company came a few days after similar protests and pickets at the Oakland port on the US West Coast that prevented the Israeli Zim ship from overloading its cargo. Similar efforts is underway by community groups and unions in Durban, South Africa. Since the 28th of April 2021, the Colombian people have been mobilizing and organizing across the country against the government's tax reforms that sought to raise the revenue by increasing taxes on basic foods and essential services such as water, electricity, gas and sanitation. The strike was launched to demand the negotiation of the emergency plan presented to the government by the National Strike Committee. There has been massive participation on the streets of Colombia by broad sectors of the population. The National Strike Committee has denounced state and police repression of at least 2,378 cases of police violence, 50 deaths, 578 injured, 524 disappearances, 1,200 arbitrary detentions, 21 cases of sexual violence against women, and 87 other cases of gender-based violence since the beginning of the mobilizations. Despite the severe state repression, Colombians remained in the street protesting and won. The tax reforms were ditched, the finance minister has resigned, and controversial bill to privatize healthcare was abandoned. That's a wrap from the news. If you have a story you'd like to share with us, you can send a WhatsApp message or voice note to 065 902 7112. That's all from me.
Thank you, Michaela, from our news desk. We're going to go to a break and we'll get back into our studio discussion after this. Welcome back and thank you for joining us here at the Workers' World Labour Show. We're halfway through the first show of the 2021 season. In studio with me, we've got Dr. James van Duren, Deputy Secretary of the People's Health Movement. We've got Professor Leslie London, also from the People's Health Movement, and Tembeka Majali from the AIDC, Alternative Information and Development Centre. Prof. London, before the break and before the labour news, I had asked you what was the People's Health Movement, perhaps just for the benefit of people who are watching who might not know the health movement. I know you said it was a global movement. I must admit I did not know it was global. I thought once again South Africa was leading, but over to you.
So People's Health Movement is a global social movement, particularly strong in Latin America and Southeast Asia. We have chapters throughout various countries in Africa. And we are committed to a People's Charter for Health, which says two things. One is that health is a right. Everyone is entitled to the highest attainable standard of health. And also that health is a product of many social determinants. You can't buy health over a counter or get it from a doctor. There are many things you need to be healthy, like clean water, decent housing. And that's the rationale for what we do. And I think that's come out so clearly with COVID. And Tembeka pointed out the problems with the ARV access in the past. And you mentioned this idea that what have we learned over 40 years? Well, it is true that we scored a great victory with antiretrovirals because we pressured the World Trade Organization to introduce changes that enabled intellectual property to stop being an obstacle to access to ARVs. And we won that. But it was an incomplete victory because essentially what happened is the World Trade Organization introduced some changes to make the rules still there, but not really get rid of them. So in fact, what's happened now with COVID is that these same rules have really blocked the development of vaccines in a way that provides us all with access. And that's why we're seeing very few producers across the world retaining their intellectual property, deciding to whom they sell and for how much they sell. And if you're not the wealthiest country in the world, you go to the back of the queue. And all the mechanisms that were set up by the World Health Organization to try and provide access to vaccines have not worked, because rich countries basically get to the front of the queue, and now they have so much vaccine, they're doing us a favor by giving it back to us.
Yeah.
But that's the point. Tembeka's argument about changing the rules is so important, and that's why South Africa and India's waiver proposal to the WTO is really important, and it's actually getting quite a lot of support. And in fact, at the moment, it's only really the European Union, Germany particularly, and the UK that are staunchly opposed to it. Even the US realize that it's not really in their interest to carry on opposing it. So I think we should push it really hard. But the interesting thing is that while South Africa is very progressive in the WTO, we are still sitting with a domestic set of laws which basically allows companies to get away with anything when it comes to patenting medicines. And that needs to change. There's been a Fix the Patent Laws campaign ongoing for years, and we should pressurize the Department of Trade and Industry to clean up its house domestically as well, so that patents are not an obstacle to access to care.
Thanks, Prof. London. I think that what you describe, what Tembeka describes, clearly is the beginnings of another global mass action against, once again, we're back at intellectual property. But James, let's bring you back here. And I want to get back to some of the science. Now, it boggles the mind, quite frankly, that we could not develop a vaccine for HIV in 40 years, but we could develop a COVID-19 vaccine over 12 months because there was economics at stake. Is one, I would like to think it's one of the reasons. But the concerns, are they valid around people developing clots? And in some cases, certain pockets of the population developing an extreme resistance and dying. How dangerous are these side effects, or is this just par for the course in vaccine development, James?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think there's two questions there. The one about the time frame and how it was possible to develop a range of COVID vaccines, really. A number of different companies developed a number of different types of vaccines for COVID in the short time frame. And the second question being around adverse events. So for the first part, I think that you're correct that one of the large driving factors behind being able to develop or research anything is having appropriate funding. There was certainly enough funding available from major multinational NGOs as well as state funding for the development of COVID vaccines. I mean, there were certainly economic imperatives driving a lot of this donation, but that meant that a lot of the vaccine researchers were able to get appropriate funding for their work, whereas that's not always been the case for a lot of neglected diseases, and certainly not for HIV in early stages of the HIV epidemic. But it's more than just that. It's also a range of improvements in the available technology. Some of the vaccines that we will hear about are things like the Pfizer vaccine and the Mrna vaccine. Pfizer is one that we will be accessing in South Africa, make use of new types of technology, new types of vaccine technology, something called mRNA vaccines, where instead of infecting someone with a deactivated virus or a little bit of a virus or a protein, you actually inoculate them with what is called mRNA, which is this messenger protein that tells the body how to make little bits of the surface of the spike protein of a vaccine, of an infective agent like COVID. And by giving them this messenger information, instead of vaccinating them with a bit of a virus, they're able to produce quite a strong immune response, and it's much quicker to develop. We can potentially see a lot of other diseases having vaccines developed using mRNA technology. And then other reasons that it was quicker was because of changes in the trial process, that people were able to do what's called stacking of trials, where instead of waiting until one phase of the development of a vaccine is completed and then having to go through a lot of administrative and bureaucratic procedures, there was a lot of effort put into allowing these different stages of the trials to happen concurrently. So we still got the same amount of data and same amount of evidence of the effectiveness and safety of the vaccines, but we were able to do it in a much shorter time. And then on to the question of adverse events. I think it's important not to dismiss people's concerns about anything that they are worried about with regards to medicines, but certainly with the clotting events that you referred to. So there was some evidence that came out, or some reports, shall I say, around the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that there was clotting associated events with these vaccines. In terms of numbers, though, it's important to look at that. And as my last look, in over the 8 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines that were given in the US, there were about 16 reported cases of this particular type of blood clot, which is very rare. It's 1 to 2 cases per million. And that's, in fact, in keeping with what the occurrence is in the general population of people who don't get the vaccine. So a lot of these things are being identified simply because of the amount of scrutiny that is placed on vaccine trials and those who are getting their vaccines. And it's important to also recognize that we're weighing this with the risk of having COVID itself. And the clotting risks and the adverse event risks of actually getting COVID are significantly higher than that shown with any vaccine.
James, I want to
has
bring
been developed.
Tembeka into that. But the last part of what you just spoke about was the risk. Tembeka, if you remember the insert, people seem to have generally quite a good understanding of why they need to take the vaccine. This was across the board. We saw the young woman, we saw the taxi driver. They were very, very, some of them, of course, acknowledging that they are nervous.
Yes.
Tell me, the many organizations that you work with, what has been the responses in terms of them encouraging people? And what has been their experience of the registration system, which we know has been part of this uneven access to the vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, like any campaign, the People's Vaccine Campaign is one example, and which consists of various organizations. The message is very clear there: accessible vaccine for all. And many organizations have been, I would say, successful in doing that. But at the same time, the very clear messaging of saying to the people what's the hindrance, besides side effects, the clotting and all the other issues that James and Leslie raised. You still have a developed country that sits with how to regulate these medicines and vaccines. The Food and Drug Administration in the US dictates terms for us as to which vaccine must be available now to the society, who's going to benefit. And yet, studies have been saying...
We have to go to a break, but when we come back, we're going to talk more about the control that the FDA and the US has over, as you say, the access to and the regulation thereof. Don't go away, you at home. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. Tembeka, before the break, I very rudely interrupted you. You were talking about how the US, through their FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, dictates global regulatory processes for how to roll out much-needed drugs. Over to you.
Yes, and forgetting that this is a global pandemic. In an emergency situation, you don't have to be bullying other countries, which is the case, I would say, now with the FDA.
Tembeka, can I just ask you, just before you continue, so in the week, we had been waiting, Leslie and James, we had been waiting for a delivery of drugs that were coming from the US. I mean, of course, mainstream media in South Africa would make it seem as if it was our own ineptitude, and yet that was the example of the FDA that had been stalling, which meant that we could not put those vaccines out in the program?
Yeah, as much as we are calling for TRIPS waiver, which is, for me, it addresses two things. One, the developed countries which now have become hindrance to the provision of vaccines, but at the same time, you don't want that situation, which is don't be bullies, and at the same time, you want to prevent opportunists that might cling on this call for TRIPS waiver to smuggle their own agendas into this call. So it addresses those two issues. So if FDA feels that, no, we're going to hold on to this vaccine, yet the message has been that all the countries have researched about the vaccines. So therefore, the provision must be equitable and it must be for the benefit of the people, and vaccine must be seen as a public good. So this is the situation now. We don't know whether to believe that some of the information that we are getting in terms of which vaccine to approve now for which country, whether it's true or not. This is the situation, and I think the more message we get across from the developing countries to say, don't block this. We don't need gatekeepers which hold on to their patent and their greed, but at the same time, guard against opportunists that would want to smuggle their own agendas and corporations onto us. So this is the dilemma that we are faced with.
It's a balancing act. And yet, Leslie, the opportunists that Thembeka talks about are even inside our country. This is part of the tensions between the public sector and the state's mandate to deliver health services, and the private sector that have a very different agenda. What is your view on this, this window for opportunism, as Thembeka puts it, within the vaccine, the science of the vaccine and the manufacturing of the vaccine?
Well, you know, with any technology, there'll always be the opportunity for profiteering, and we need a firm and capable state to be able to manage that. Unfortunately, we don't have a firm and capable state able to do that. So we saw during COVID all kinds of things being done, things being sold, things which weren't effective. And we need a regulator that's able to say this vaccine is effective and safe. The problem in a way is that we have a state that's being pushed from both sides. And we've seen, for instance, the private sector try to push the state to say that the private sector should be able to procure vaccines independently of the state. And that would be a disaster, because it would mean that there's no coordination, that we don't get adherence to one policy, that basically people who can afford it will be able to pay and get their vaccines and get out the door, while elderly people or people with comorbidities who are too poor will have to wait. And that's a situation we can't tolerate. And that's why we have to have one program. And we need a state that's able to manage it, but we need a state that's effective and efficient. And that's our problem. You've referred to the problem that people in rural areas or poorer areas can't get onto the system properly. Well, the state didn't do enough to make sure that that was implemented. So, of course, there's going to be opportunists who are going to take advantage of that to make money.
James, let's bring you in here on the same track. You know, you were a practicing doctor and you're part of the People's Health Movement. Is the country and the Department of Health, are we on track to vaccinate enough people? We saw in the clip the President spoke about 10%. Is that enough to achieve population immunity? And let us use the term population immunity and not herd immunity. James?
Sure. So what the President was speaking about there was the COVAX facility, which is one of these multinational facilities that is meant to enable a lot of lower and middle income countries to procure vaccines at a lower price through pooling of resources to ensure that some countries which would otherwise not be able to procure their own vaccines are able to get access to vaccines at the time when countries like Canada, the UK, and the US have bought enough stock to cover their populations 3 or 4 times over. So 10% is certainly not enough to reach what's called herd population immunity, as you say correctly. Population immunity is something that's calculated based on the number of infections someone who has a disease would cause. And the average calculations that people use is around 67% of the population would need to be vaccinated before you would achieve herd immunity. That's not to say that there's no value in giving vaccines to high-risk groups, which is what the state is doing under its 3-stage approach. So vaccines, herd immunity is not the only goal. If we give vaccines to those who are at most high risk, we would reduce a lot of the significant morbidity and the number of deaths in those populations. So those are people who are the elderly, high exposure groups such as healthcare workers, and those with comorbidities like diabetes and hypertension, etc. But in terms of the approaching new wave, we don't seem to be on track to avoiding it. The number of cases of continue to climb in a number of provinces, and it seems that we are going to have to weather that storm, vaccines or not. But it's certainly the fact that there is a new wave happening now is not an indication that we should slow down or in any way halt or delay our vaccination program. In fact, James, it is perhaps a call to try and expand that as soon as we can.
So James, that is probably the biggest challenge, is to continue the vaccine rollout program alongside this third wave. And it should in no way deter people from going to get their vaccine.
Definitely. I mean, one of the biggest impacts COVID has had on the country has not been just on the economics of our people and on the lives of those who've had COVID, but it's on the whole health status of those who normally make use of primary and secondary level facilities, normally going for their childhood immunizations or their chronic medicine dates, etc. People avoiding healthcare settings because of that. So I think that the continued availability of vaccines during this period is essential, and perhaps this is the time that we should really rally behind getting those at-risk groups who don't have access to the registration process or not as familiar with where the local sites are or don't have transport, etc. We should really be rallying behind trying to support those groups and getting vaccinated at a time like this.
Thanks, James. We really can't have this conversation around, our public sector's response to the pandemic, Tembeka, without just a quick focus on the allegations of corruption against the National Minister, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, regarding health contracts with communications consultants. Without getting into the politics of that, do you think that that's going to have an impact on our ability, the Department of Health's ability, to roll out, given that this is a minister that has been at the helm, he's a practicing doctor, and he has scientific respect within our community, scientific community?
The suspension of the minister, if you call it a suspension, should not delay the progress in terms of vaccine provision. Work should happen, and it should continue, and the campaigning against, for national vaccination should continue as well. The communication that has been there, the lines of communication between National Department of Health, civil society, and various stakeholders should continue. And I must say that private health has a role to play, but it's just that you need a government to play a central role. Hence, the message from the beginning of this campaign was that you do not want to open up a floodgate where private companies buy vaccines for themselves. So the problem with that, when government buys for public, it might be very expensive. So rather have a system, a better coordination, whereby everybody gets from this central pool, which is government playing that central role. So, and I think that work should continue, and we should all have confidence in that work, and that government has the capability, together with the unions, to provide vaccines for all.
Thank you for that, Tembeka. The work must continue. Prof. London, I'd like to bring you in here. If you could tell our viewers about, and we're coming to the end of our show, the People's Vaccine Campaign. How can people get involved? What do they need to do? And I'll give opportunity for Tembeka and for James to come in here as well. In 45 seconds or less, Prof.
So the People's Vaccine Campaign is a global campaign for a different way to address COVID through solidarity. There are organizations that are part of the vaccine campaign, and if your organization wants to join, please contact us or contact us through Workers World, or look up the C19 People's Coalition on COVID, and you'll find all the information on the website about how to join. We want organizations to support this campaign and to help build a solid, unified movement based on social solidarity.
James, maybe you can give our viewers a sense of what are some of the central, I don't want to say demands, but the central themes of the campaign. And does it link up with the global movement as well? Because of course, you know, vaccine apartheid is not unique to South Africa.
Thanks, yes, yeah. So the South African People's Vaccine Campaign, so as there's the notes, there's a international campaign as well, similarly named. The South African People's Vaccine Campaign grew out of a number of organizations, and one of the groupings that was noted was the C19 People's Coalition, but there's a number of other NGOs in the healthcare space
James, I'm going to have to ask you to press pause, but I'm very quickly going to advise people at home to go onto the People's Vaccine social media pages from us here at Workers' World. Thank you to our guests for a very invigorating conversation. Till next time, I'm Helgi Jansen-Doubier here at the Workers' World Labour Show.
Thank you.
James, I'm so sorry to have done that to you.